We are embarking on the third and final in the series of 3 fears that sabotage your dreams. And remember from the first 2 entries, these are basically the same fear with many faces. So one of the weeks we talked about the fear of loss. Will it cost too much? We talked about the fear of disappointment. Will I be happy if I follow the will of God? And this week we're going to talk about the fear of suffering. Will it be too painful? Will I have the courage to see it through? So what we're talking about is when God or Source comes to you and asks you to do something really outlandish to your friends, or something that seems like it has a huge cost, or something that just doesn't make any sense, but you know that God is asking you to do it and to take a journey of faith. So today we're going to talk about the fear of suffering. But first, let's talk about courage, because will I have the courage to see it through? The answer to that is not before you need it. So in my case, anytime that God has come to me and asked me to give up something or follow a path that just looked really scary or too big for me, I didn't have the courage ahead of time. That's the whole point of faith. I only had the courage once I started down that path, and then I was given the courage. So the next thing we're going to talk about is suffering. Will it cause too much suffering? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. First, let's talk about just the word suffering. The entire purpose of our lifetime here on this plane is to learn how to give up our small self or our ego or our obstinate will in order to follow a divine path through faith. And the unfortunate thing for us in this is that we have to suffer in order to do this, but not forever. So a lot of times when we are asked to take a hard path, it looks a lot like dying. But the good news is there's a lot of benefits and a lot of comfort and a lot of joy and amazing things that come through it. And your life is actually transformed, which is a good thing, because it makes you happier and it makes you love people more and God, and it makes you trust the process more in your life. So I'm going to give you a real life example today from my situation. I don't usually talk about this because up until now, it was probably a little too recent in my past, but I feel like today I'm ready to tell you about something that caused a lot of suffering in following the will of God. When my girls were little, and this was about 20 years ago, I went through a very awful, high conflict divorce. And unfortunately, at that time, our 2 girls became the rope in a game of tug of war, only it wasn't a game. People were getting hurt, and the girls were a casualty. So there came a time when I had the opportunity to go to court and probably win nearly full custody of them, just because of a lot of the surrounding circumstances. And I was all ready to do this when I feel like God or the universe or my source stopped me and said, no, this is not the way that you are going to have the relationship with your girls that you want, or that you are going to go through this story. And I felt that God asked me to drop my end of the rope in this tug of war over the girls. Now you have to understand, I was a young mom. I had been a stay-at-home mom. Like, I loved and still love my girls so much. Like, the thought of dropping my end of the rope and letting go of control was so painful. I couldn't even hardly fathom the idea of this. But God was very clear about this, and he or she gave me the story of Solomon, where the 2 women brought him a baby, and it was 2 mothers, and they each had a baby, and one of them rolled over on her baby in the night and suffocated him or her, and she was jealous, and they were fighting over the mother's baby who still had the living baby. So they brought the baby to Solomon, fighting over it, and asked him to decide who should have the baby. And Solomon said, "Bring me my sword, and I will cut the baby in 2, and you can each take half home." Well, I'm sure you've heard this story, and the real mother said, "No, that's the worst thing that could happen. Please just let her take the baby. And then Solomon knew who the rightful mother was, and the good king restored the baby to the rightful mother. And that was the story that God very heavily impressed on my heart. And there were many other reassurances at this time, which, you know, when you are listening for the will of God and he or she is asking you to do something this profoundly life altering, especially where other people are involved, you really have to know that you're being given this guidance. But the thing is, you can trust your heart, and you know when God is speaking to you, because you just get so many reassurances from every direction that this is what you're being asked to do. So it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because at that time my ex-husband was the type to use something like this against me, and I knew it would mean that I wouldn't really get to have a very meaningful relationship with my daughters for a lot of their childhood after that. And they were a little bit older. One was 14 and one was 11, so I'd had a significant time in their lives, but I still knew it was going to cost a lot, and it was very painful. But I did drop my end of the rope, and I just allowed this process to unfold. And the thing I learned through this is God did give me the promise that I would have my daughters restored back into my life, but I didn't know how long this would take. And this was part of the pain of this process. It took a good probably 8 to 10 years before I saw this fully fulfilled. But I want to tell you now why I think this happened, aside from the fact that I definitely have needed times in my life where I needed to go through a death process and come out the other side as a transformed person. For one thing, I'm so much more compassionate about people's pain having gone through this, and I also know that there's always two sides to a story, and that you can't judge things from the outside looking in, because I felt like a lot of people probably judged me and thought that I abandoned my girls, or they maybe even thought that briefly in their lives. And so that was one of the things I learned through this. I also learned a deep trust in God to fulfill the promises that were given to me, because over time I definitely saw that God could be trusted with the thing most precious to me in my life, which was the hearts and lives of my daughters. And I saw that through dropping my end of the rope, which, if you think about tug of war, what happens when you drop your end of the rope? Usually your enemy falls down. And my ex-husband in this case was not my enemy. The enemy was basically my own ego, or the things that would keep me from trusting this process and knowing that I didn't ultimately have control over my girls' hearts and lives. So I did drop my end of the rope, and I was able to watch my need for control and distrust fall to the ground. And over time, I saw beautiful fruit come out of this. For one thing, as my daughters have grown into adulthood, they have just become lovely, beautiful, stable young women. And they have thanked me many times for dropping my end of the rope and letting them just have a real childhood where they didn't have to always feel tugged back and forth. And they've let me know that they know I did this out of love, and that it was exactly the right thing that they needed in this situation, because they would have never been at peace. And if I had been too small-minded or too territorial or too possessive or too controlling to trust God with these beautiful souls, they would probably not be as healthy and well-adjusted and happy as they are in their adult lives. So I am beyond grateful that I followed this directive in my life, even though it cost me so much and was very painful. I would do it all over again this way when I see the results. So also, as I mentioned before, I'm here to transform, and it had wonderful benefits in my life of just trusting life, trusting the process, transforming, knowing that I'm in a safe story, I'm in a safe universe. Things are going to work out in my favor. I'm sure you've maybe heard the quote, "The universe is conspiring in your favor." And I have lived a life where I have seen this time and again, and so I have no regrets. Lastly, I'll just say that this journey is about learning to live by faith and not by sight, which is the opposite of everything that we are told to do in this story. But it's a beautiful journey, and I hope you've enjoyed these 3 examples of how I faced my fears, and I got to see amazing results from just trusting God, turning over my life and my will, not feeling like I'm in control, and just falling into the beautiful grace and love of God. So I will talk to you next week.
You probably don't know the home where my mind goes. It's the only space I feel safe. Oh, I've gone too deep. It softly kills me, but you're singing me to sleep.